Hello, hello. Wonderful to see everyone.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming a little early for our pre-concert talk. I'm Chris Morrison. With me, Laura Jackson, of course, music director and conductor of the Reno Phil. And to my right, John Nakamatsu, our piano soloist this afternoon. Thank you both for being here, and congratulations on last night. One performance in the books.
That's right.
That's such a demanding piece, the Brahms First Concerto. I assume that when you're playing a piece like that twice within, 20 hours or so, you have an in-between concert routine that you stick to, or you're so used to it at this point that you don't worry about that so much?
He has a 7-year-old.
So
there are no routines anymore. In fact, this morning we were at Circus, so that's my concert routine.
Yeah.
No, I try to just, have as few hang-ups as possible. That's the funny thing is that, it's very easy to fall into traps with this profession, that you have to have certain things in order to, because so much of what we do is so focused, and that we have to, we spend so much of our time just concentrating that sometimes it's best if I just get away from it and try not to think about it until I absolutely have to. I mean, one of the things that happens after a performance is that when it's quiet back in the hotel room and the lights are all out, I start to go through every single note of the concert again, whether I want to or not.
I do too.
It's kind of, it happens involuntarily, and it can be a very painful experience because
I find that I create painful experiences, like things that I thought went really great right after the concert, then I'm like, oh, I'm not sure.
Oh, that's exactly it. And it happens in, very peaceful times, like in the shower or something where you think you'd be relaxing and actually you're really thinking about that. So as much as possible, I try not to have to do any one thing. I think what I would like to do, obviously, before any performance is at some point to take a little bit of a nap. Because I think that is brain food, I try to eat a big meal earlier in the day so I have enough energy to get through whatever I need to do. And then I get to the hall early because that's my thing. But other than that, I try not to have too many superstitions and develop any, unnatural kinds of things, because there's rarely a situation where every time you can have your ideal pre-concert situation. I mean, sometimes someone's talking to you right up to the second you're walking on the stage. Other times, you never see another human, Like there are some times in other countries where they open the door for you and you're wrong. You're like, oh, okay, well. So each time it's different and the demands are different, and my day changes, but somehow when we're sitting here and the lights go down, it all is familiar again.
Just by observing, we've been so lucky to have John back again and again and again because we absolutely love him, and he's a member of our family, yes?
Yay.
But I will say that what I observe is that other than just coming to the hall early, you have another pre-concert ritual.
And what is that?
Which is playing through things slowly.
Yeah.
So I walked in today at 2 o'clock, pretty much right at 2 o'clock. And he was playing through the Brahms in slow motion. So and you did that yesterday too?
Yes.
So is that like is that how you is that sort of meditative? Why do you do that?
Like, for example, today, the only time I had to touch the piano was just when I arrived to the hall, and there was nothing in the morning. And again, every day is different, because yesterday we did have the dress rehearsal and then a period of nothing and then coming back to the hall. But I do like to go through things very slowly. In the case of a recital, for example, where it's basically like 90 minutes to 2 hours of music that I have to review, I don't always do it then. And I pick and choose. I mean, largely this morning I was going through it because it was fun. And I know that I don't have another Brahms one. And so after I play it for you, I will put it away and close the book and not look at it again for years. And so it was kind of a sentimental retrospective of just this week and the journey that this Brahms one brought me, because each time that I get to do it, I feel like it's different. And as I was going through all the places, I was not only thinking of things that I have to make better today than yesterday for me, but also just how different it was for this collaboration. And I mean that in the best way. I mean, we've had so much fun this week with the orchestra and on stage, and I think it's just like today is me saying goodbye to it for a little while, or so long, and until next time.
Yeah, you know, I actually, when I am nervous before a concert, I often think of that. I mean, how much we dearly, dearly love to perform these great works. And when you think of it, you know, the number of minutes you string together in your life that you'll get to do it, or how many times, actually in my lifetime, will I get to go through the journey of this Brahms First Piano Concerto. So that usually helps me with the nerves piece, because I have to, how can you not savor every single moment when you realize you're going to have to put it away for a little while, or you realize, and that will be the same for me too. You know, I don't know when I'll do this piece again.
That's right. And there are some times, some parts of it, well, that I will be glad to put away for years because they scare me every time they happen. But yeah, that's the other thing, you know. And so there's a practical value to doing that as well, which is just, you know, review what you need to review right before the test. But everything else you hope you have learned during your long studies.
Brahms sets a pretty high bar for you in this concerto, not only in terms of just, you know, dexterity and fast fingers, but also pure strength, and the fact that it's like 45, 50 minutes long. That's a big chunk of music.
It was, I think, until that point, probably the longest piano concerto that anyone had ever written.
Yeah, I think so.
That was probably one of the reasons people hissed when they first heard it. But and
Please
the fact,
don't do that.
Can you imagine that happening today? I mean, I just. But the other thing is that, you know, it was a very different type of work than people were used to hearing. You know, a concerto is theater in some ways. You know, it is a big orchestra, it's a soloist, it's a very grand event, and it's a spectacle. And so in that era of romantic traveling virtuoso pianists, which was, you know, slightly new, people were used to being entertained. They were used to having a flashy piano soloist, you know, with lots of notes and tricks, and it looked like a circus, and then the orchestra's kind of playing behind them for the most part. This was completely not like this. In fact, from the very first note, it's all about seriousness and angst and drama and very, I think, inward introspection kind of music, and I think it confused his audiences, and it certainly wasn't flashy in the same way that other concertos are. The strength that you need, of course, is monumental, and the focus and concentration, but it's as though I am a member of the orchestra for the most part. There are extended solos, but even some of these are not very flashy. They are purely musical, and I think that's what Brahms was. He was, you know, he wrote this particular piece when he was 25. So imagine that, you know, 25 years old, and so it's probably about the flashiest he'd ever be in terms of his piano writing. But where he is taking us is the orchestra is part of the piano, and the piano is part of the orchestra. And I think you'll see that right away. Even my entrance, my very first entrance, is not a huge flourish. It's a continuation of something that just developed out of organically what you just said.
It's actually interesting that the orchestra plays for a really long time before the piano soloist comes in. So, you know, we play for like, I don't know, 4 minutes or something while he's just hanging out there. So I promise he has something to play. He actually plays quite a lot, but it just doesn't happen right at the top. And, you know, you mentioned something really interesting last night. He was talking about the way in which you're dropped into this scene of high drama at the very beginning. It's not like an intro to the piece.
Yeah, weirdly enough, we actually were talking about this exact same thing one concert ago with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
Oh,
where right at the
yes.
beginning, you are plunged into some high drama and you don't know exactly where you are, but you're right in the middle of it right from the start. And just as much so, if not more so, with this Brahms concerto.
Yeah, no, you're right. I had forgotten about that. It's sort of like, you know, the movie starts and we're all of a sudden in a car chase or something. It's just this huge dramatic scene.
And it's not too surprising to note that Brahms was, when he was putting this music together originally, he was thinking in symphonic terms. He was thinking this might turn into a symphony. He ended up abandoning that, turned it into a 2-piano sonata, and then into the concerto. But a lot of that sort of symphonic ambition still resides in this piece, it sure seems like, along with being a great showpiece for yourself.
I think so. And I think that's why Brahms really moved away from writing specifically for large forms for the solo piano. I mean, he was a pianist himself, but he wasn't writing for himself in the way that Liszt was, you know, to tour with this, to really impress audiences and enormous crowds with his pianism, as well as his, you know, whatever he had. But Brahms was more, I think, a symphonist from the beginning. And so he devoted most of his works, his major works, to chamber music or collaborative pieces. In fact, the 3 huge piano sonatas that he wrote were his opus 1, 2, and 5, when he was barely in his early 20s. And he never wrote another piano sonata after this. And when you think about it, as we were talking about last night, you know, Beethoven had written 9 symphonies and 32 piano sonatas, and when each one of those is considered a masterwork, how can you better that? And I think that's one of the reasons why the Romanticists and beyond kind of went away from those traditional forms. Brahms was the one anomaly who really stuck in that form, but made them his own in his own way. Later in life, he wrote a lot of short piano music, short pieces, and they were amazing, but he never returned to these big forms, wrote only 2 piano concertos, and they are monumental. Some consider the best that we have. It's a treasure for us to be able to play this. And I think because he wrote for the symphony primarily and for pure music, he wasn't always writing pianistically, and sometimes it's a very, very uncomfortable music to play. It's physically difficult and not always fun.
You know, at the first rehearsal when we were playing it through together, we played through the first movement, and I turned around and said to him, I said, don't you feel like we just played an entire concerto and we're just done with the first movement? The first movement is 20-something minutes long, like 21 minutes. And by the way, last night was the first time that you heard it live,
It's
correct?
the truth. Amazingly enough, it's not like I've never been to concerts before. I've been going to concerts, well, since my late teens anyway, and for some reason or another, Brahms won and I never crossed paths. It happened once, I remember, when I was working for the Reno Chamber Orchestra many years ago, and I think I got sick or something and ended up missing that performance. So last night was quite a pleasure. And what a piece. I mean, it really is impressive. And I know Brahms looms kind of large in your music making. You've made recordings of his music. You have alluded to this already, but talk a little bit about Brahms's style of writing for the piano. It's pretty distinctive. And along with that, since you've also recorded early and late Brahms, in fact, you combine the 2 on one of your CDs, did his style evolve over the years?
I think so. I think like all composers who I think have a lifetime of writing, you notice how they eventually pare away what they feel is less essential. And what you're left with at the end is usually a more lean version of what they started with. And we were talking about Rachmaninoff, the Paganini variations, which is something that I think first played together here or at one time.
I think you're right.
It may have been our
it was the
first.
first time, yeah.
But that is a very different piece than his 3rd concerto, say, where there's so many notes. There are so fewer notes in the Paganini. And I think similarly in Brahms's late works, it's distilled. It's where every single note matters. And I still feel that in this piece, but there is more excess, you know, there's more just kind of, it's filled with ideas, and that's The third sonata, the first sonata, the same. It was so overflowing that the third sonata is in 5 movements, you know, and he could have written more, but it was already about 50 minutes, so probably better he didn't. But that was what was going through him, and eventually that all kind of tapered off. So the piano writing is similar. It's just very big here.
You know, there was something that that I experienced. We talked a little bit about yesterday, which is for me, the real issue with Brahms is what happens between the notes. What happens, the initiation of one note, and then what happens on the way to the next, on the way to the next. It's all about line. It's the tension of the line. It's carrying it through and loving every single note. It's for the strings. It's not letting the sound diminish as you approach the tip, which is the lighter end of the bow, and it's further from your arm. So if you don't compensate for that, you can sort of lose the sound. It can get softer and then louder again. So it's all about sustain. And yet, on a piano, it's impossible to sustain, right? You have a hammer and you press. So how do you do this?
We fake it.
But fake it very well.
It's so funny because, you know, it's the big irony of the piano. Is the one thing that we cannot do is go from one note up to another note. You know, as soon as you hit the string, there's this blip of sound that just eventually does this. So unlike any sustaining instrument or a voice, you can't go, ah. You can't go from one note up to another. You can only go from one down to another. So anything that you want to make go up has to be done in kind of tricky ways. And one is you use all the other voices, maybe something that's moving, to give the sense that the sound is not ending, but it's expanding. You use time. So someone once told me, if you play, more than 3 beats like a metronome, then you're not playing the piano right. Because you need to use microseconds to manipulate time to kind of create this sense of buoyancy or one note coming off another. So any student who's just playing, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note like this starts to sound really vertical, where everything is just ting, 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 ting. And if you hear the hammer sound, that gives it even more of a vertical sense and not the lyrical sense that Laura was just talking about. So our whole lives are spent trying to be a string player and trying to imitate and, essentially fake what a string player does so naturally. And that's even in the mentality of piano students. We often hear pianists who sound, even non-musicians hear that. They like, it sounds a little bumpy, or they have interesting ways of describing how music sounds. But what they are describing is kind of the hammer, the percussive aspect of a percussion instrument that really isn't supposed to sound like a percussion instrument. So
some composers take good advantage of that percussive
That's
nature
right.
of the instrument, but in other cases, Brahms being one of them, sustaining that long line as you were describing is necessary for everybody.
And there are certainly very, very percussive moments in this piece, especially you will hear in the first movement. There are things that have to be very, very vertical, but that's in direct contrast to all of the lyrical sections where you are really trying to just build lines.
For instance, the second movement, which
Absolutely.
is so ethereal and,
Yeah, but we were talking last night about the fact that Brahms wrote this piece, started on this piece at least, right after he had met Robert and Clara Schumann, people that he greatly admired. And he is a 20-year-old pianist, sort of just getting going, and he impressed them so. And Schumann, in what I think was his last article as a music critic, praised Brahms to the sky. And it's in that sort of atmosphere that Brahms is starting to write this piece, and he was explicit, which is, it occurs to me, is kind of interesting. We know now that he was explicit in telling Clara Schumann that the second movement of this concerto is a portrait of her. But he didn't tell the public that. We only know that because many, many decades have passed, and we've been able to look at their letters. But we know now that Brahms had Clara in mind in writing the slow movement, which, as you say, is so ethereal and so beautiful.
This is one of my favorite pieces of music ever, just this second movement of this concerto. And as we were saying last night, I almost hate to play the third move. I wish it just stopped after the second move, because you'll hear the ending. It ends like this music is not of our world. And suddenly and then I start by that's even worse. I start by myself. And so I just think, oh, but it makes sense once you get going. It's just, getting to that point. But the second movement is so moving. And again, it's just, I don't know how else to describe it. But.
That makes it even more scary, knowing how meaningful it is. The orchestra, we start it all by ourselves. So we start the second movement all by ourselves. So.
Well, it's also interesting because he wrote right at the beginning of that movement a quote from Latin that you knew it exactly.
Benedictus qui venit in nomine Domini.
Yes, so
blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
Right, and in one way that is, maybe Clara Schumann, who he revered as someone who was, so important to him. But also, this will sound like a bit of a hymn to you when it happens. And Brahms had great knowledge of Renaissance music, of choral music, of this type of singing. So it's almost as though voices are carrying all of these suspensions. And I think that's what makes it most moving. It's that these chords go from suspended note to suspended note, and sometimes harmonies nothing really ends definitively. Even the ending of the whole movement is like, there's so much more left to tell.
It's almost like a question.
It's a question. Everything in Brahms is a question. There's no resolution. And I think that's, you can liken it to his or to his biography, but, everything in his life was a little bit unresolved. His relationship with Clara, his relationship with women, his relationship with, everything was not 100% with closure. And even this first movement, how much you separate life from art, who knows? But many have likened this movement to his state of mind right after Robert Schumann had tried to commit suicide and then was put into an asylum for the rest of his life. He had died, and this was the reaction to it. So, again, if you think about that and listen to the opening moments that Laura will create, it is so amazing. And that might make sense of kind of this chaotic, dramatic feel that's unstable throughout that whole first movement.
I know that you have a lot to do this afternoon, so we're going to let you go a little early and get yourself prepared for 50 minutes or so of playing later today. John, thank you so much for taking time out and speaking to us. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, John. Yeah, it was exciting listening to the performance last night, I have to say.
I'm so glad. It's always a wonderful thing when you're performing to know that somebody's hearing it for the first time. That's like an extra honor to be the performer for that. It's great.
Which is going to happen with the other two works on today's program, too, I think, for many here. Certainly, I had not encountered Nkara Okoye before, but we start the program with a short piece of hers, which, when she was originally commissioned, it was just going to be another piece of music, but then 9/11 happened.
Yes.
And her approach to what she was composing changed dramatically. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So Nkiru is a brilliantly talented, emerging Nigerian-American composer. And she set out in the wake of 9/11 to write a piece. First, she was thinking sort of commemorating the grief, the suffering, processing all of that. And she found she was coming up with nothing, just absolutely nothing was coming to her. So then she decided to change her point of view, her tactic. And she decided to make it about a response that is about living, about being fearless, about moving forth in the world despite this and not letting it affect her choices in how she lives. And so instead of writing what she originally meant to title Voices Crying Out, she then wrote Voices Shouting Out, and it's a joyful, energetic, courageous kind of shout. And the other interesting thing is that she writes it in the form of a march. And this is she said this is for those fighting bravely for our safety.
And in between that work and the Brahms, we have 7 minutes to describe a piece of music that the two of us could spend 70 minutes easily talking about.
I know.
A great favorite of both of ours, the Symphony No. 6 by Jan Sibelius, a piece that does not get played all that often. And I was so struck when I was looking at the season for the first time and saw Sibelius No. 6. I decided to come to the concert. I wanted to hear it.
Yay, yay, I'm so glad. I love this symphony so much, and I have wanted my entire career to conduct this. So I will have a great time today, and I know that I'm going to make Sibelius nuts out of all of you from this piece. That is my wish and my hope. I fell in love with Sibelius as a composer when I was the assistant conductor of the Atlanta Symphony, and my mentor, the music director, Robert Spano, did a fair amount of Sibelius. And at first glance, my impression of Sibelius's writing was a little bit like this. I mean, it was very strange to me, and I could never really follow a certain thread and know how he would get from point A to point B. It seemed kind of erratic. And after a while, what is it? After a while, it just kind of seeps into your bones and you can't live without it. There's something so unique about his compositional voice, something so deep in your bones beautiful about his melodic writing. And then there's something so quirky about the tangents that happen in between those gorgeous melodies that it's just absolutely fascinating to me. His music in general is fascinating. And then, the more famous symphonies, the first and the second and the fifth, they have triumphant moments for sure. And Sibelius dearly loved nature, and you hear sounds of nature in his pieces. But there was a lot of mid and deep sonorities, dark music, darkness in his writing. And this particular symphony, I think, has so much optimism, so much almost naive kind of cheerfulness that is just so endearing and so sort of embracing. And I think that is what really drew me to this piece when I first heard it.
One of the orchestra members used the word airy in talking about the piece last night. And you'll notice, technically speaking, the orchestra in the Sibelius Symphony is larger than that in the Brahms Symphony, but it's not going to sound that way a lot of the time.
It's true.
Because Sibelius is so sparing and delicate with the effects that he uses. Very often, we'll have 3 trombones in the orchestra. They barely play. They're important when they do play, but we don't hear them much. But so often we're just hearing, say, the violins and the violas and the woodwinds, maybe the harp, maybe a quiet timpani in the background. There's so much space. The sound is so transparent a lot of the time.
It's absolutely true. I was talking to another patron last night that said it shimmers. There's something about the quality that is sort of ghostly. A few things contribute to that. The trebleness of the writing, you'll see that the cellos, cellos and basses have incredibly important things, but it's actually, they are also used very sparingly, as are the trombones, as is the bass clarinet that is on stage. They'll insert a melody and then sort of go away. The other thing is that it's written in a Dorian mode instead of a key that has a nice sort of major quality to it that gives us a strong sense of home base. The Dorian mode, if you were to look at a piano and play from D to D on only the white keys, that you would have the Dorian mode. And what it gives you a sense of is sort of floating in space, that there is no key that is more important than another. That's how it will strike as a listener. This was a characteristic kind of use in Renaissance writing, so pre-Bach composers like Palestrina, and there's a lot of call and response that's related. So you'll hear the high strings play something, then the low strings play something, then the high do it again, then the low. That's particular in the last movement. You hear hymn-like writing at the beginning of the last movement. And then there's another broad quality that we spoke of last night, which I think is a huge part in hearing this music, which is a minimalist quality. And minimalism started in the 1960s, and it was taking a little cell and then repeating it again and again and again, and then changing it in minute ways over extended time. And there is definitely a quality of minimalism. You'll find that it sort of will seem to hover in place with a certain gesture. In the first movement, this happens where it goes around the first, second violins and violas, and it's this rhythmic figure. It's almost like a kaleidoscopic kind of wave of coming in and out, and they trade the figure. But there's a way that it feels sort of static, and then you'll hear a woodwind come in and sort of change it. So think of it in terms of sort of entering a room that is a particular color, and you're just taking that in. You're taking that ambiance in, that sort of mood, and then you'll watch the light change in the room, and I think that's a way that you can sort of embody that kind of writing.
Yeah, there are passages, some of those minimalistic passages, where you will think to yourself as a listener, okay, where is he going with this?
Yeah.
What's happening?
Yeah.
Stick with it. I mean, even having heard the piece many, many, many times over the years, I still am struck that way. There are passages where things don't seem to be quite going anywhere, but there's always a payoff at the end. So just stay in that space that Sibelius is creating for you, knowing that something really great is coming very soon. I think he's kind of playing with the listener in that way.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think the contrast between those absolutely sweet, tonal, gorgeous, melodic, or chorale-like moments contrasted with these sort of more meandering areas, they make the sweet music all that much sweeter. I hope that you will love this symphony as much as we do, and I'm so glad that you're here today. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all for coming early. Enjoy the afternoon. Thank you so much.